So, hello. I thought that I would try something a little bit different today, and that is take you on a tour of a wonderful place near me, which is Fayette State Park. Fayette was founded in 1867 by Fayette Brown and the Jackson Iron Company. It was a company town that was founded to smelt iron into pig iron, and as you can see, occasionally you can even see a really good doggo while you're standing there. Now, Fayette had at its peak about 500 immigrants, mostly from Canada and Northern Europe, and as a company town, they, at their peak of production, made about $5,000 per month back in the 1800s, and that was split between all the workers, although, as always, the supervisors ended up getting the lion's share of that. An average worker back then, the average coal man or lumberman, made about $44.80 a month with a take home pay of $18.28. So it wasn't exactly the best paying job, but it was a job, and back then that was well, as now, that was a very important thing. Fayette was abandoned in the 1891, but up until then, it was a thriving and bustling town, as thriving and bustling as anything up here in the Upper Peninsula gets. And they had a very nice hotel. As you can see, it was furnished quite beautifully. I mean, a lot of this is just recreations of furnishings and existing photographs. They're trying to match it as close as they can. Now, the hotel, which I thought was really, really interesting, the average stay for a single bed was 15 cents a night in the workman's dormitory, which was upstairs. It was also 10 cents a night if you were willing to share a bed. Now, if you were one of the supervisors or perhaps a rich person staying, you could stay in an actual room with a washroom. Note I say not a bathroom, a washroom, for $1.50 to $2 a night. Also, I had to zoom in on this Iron Age newspaper because it was published on my birthday, September 18th. I mean, granted, I wasn't around back when the paper came out, but hey, I definitely saw that. Now, the other really cool thing about the hotel is it had a two-story outhouse. I'm not exactly sure that I would want to be in the outhouse's bottom floor, but I guess if you were on the top floor, that might be okay. Now, a lot of the workers were unskilled laborers, and they stayed over on what was called Furnace Hill. It was the poor district in town, and it was not the cleanest. It was close to the slag pits and the town dump, and it was definitely noted that it was definitely not a clean area. Some soil analysis has actually found that most of the people down in this area were infected with things like whipworms, ringworm, and they definitely found a lot of lice combs all throughout the town, actually. But I would like to kind of highlight the stories of a few of the families that they do know about. They had the Duquette family. They were a family of French Canadians. It was George and Octavia who lived in the Furnace Hill area in 1873. They had an incredibly full house. It was George and Octavia, four small children, and two boarders in the house. George was a teamster, and he was a teamster who hauled wood. Another couple who lived down in Furnace Hill were Bridget and Edward McNally. They were an Irish couple who actually lived in one of these small cabins with their 7 children. Now, I'd like you to stop and think about having 7 kids in what was essentially a 2-room cabin. I mean, there was an attic upstairs, but I'm not sure how many kids you want to cram into an attic, but doesn't exactly sound like my ideal living situation. As you can see, they've got a set of stairs. Now, one interesting thing about these cabins is they had to recreate this one based on old sketches, and they actually found a surviving hut, but it had been hauled away from Fayette to be turned into like a fisherman's cottage out in the middle of the woods. They hauled it back and used it kind of as a floor plan. Now, there was another couple that I do have the story from, and most of these stories, as you can see, are taken from the walls. I did a lot of Googling and not a lot of finding, unfortunately. But our last story was Elizabeth and Abraham Bestman. Elizabeth was a young Scottish lady, and her husband Abraham was a man from Holland. He was a charcoal worker, and in 1880, when they were living in Furnace Hill, they had 3 children and Elizabeth's brother Henry, who had come from Scotland. It was definitely a hard life, but you like to think that maybe they found a little bit of joy every now and then. As you can see, they've found a lot of artifacts, and a lot of them are on display here in the town. And they're still finding artifacts constantly. I love history and things like that. Now, over here is Slag Beach, where if you're walking along, they ask you not to take it home with you, but you can find slag, which is melted rock that has fused into almost beautiful glass. And if you're really, really lucky, like I was today, you might even see a couple of loons or mergansers out on the water. So, me being me, I had to do a zoom because I thought they were just the cutest things ever. I'm very easily distractible. All right, we are going to head uptown as we go. We are heading up into kind of more the suburban area of Fayette. It was where the tradesmen lived. They had nicer houses. They had 2-story houses, definitely getting a little bit more pay. These were the skilled laborers, the things like the blacksmiths, and the jobs that weren't just shoveling coal or hauling wood. But most of them still ended up taking in boarders. It was a good way to turn a little bit of extra profit, and everybody needed somewhere to live. Inside of one of the houses, they actually found evidence that a morphine addict lived in the house. And it was when they were doing the restoration of the house, they happened to find hundreds of bottles of morphine inside of the walls. And it was actually really interesting because most of the bottles were unbroken, and you could tell that the morphine bottles were lowered and raised using a piece of lace to lower them down into the walls. Now, morphine was not illegal back then, so it wasn't exactly that big of a thing. Also, I can tell that I forgot to hit the mute on this section, so that's okay. All right, now we are heading into the Uptown District. And first, we're going to go to the home and office of C.J. Bellows, M.D. Dr. Bellows was a Civil War veteran, and in his spare time, he liked to dabble with electricity, raise exotic chickens, and racehorses. Not exactly what you think of when you think of the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, but hey, he had beautiful taste in dishes. I mean, I don't know if those were actually his dishes, but darn it, I really do like that stove. All right. And as you can see, just a couple more of the fancy people houses. Not the fanciest, but definitely a lot nicer than what we saw at Furnace Hill, especially when we come inside and look around at the houses that had carpet. They've found traces of paint and wallpaper on some of the surviving houses, and then they furnished them all with period pieces, especially this coal burning stove here in the middle of this living room. I think I absolutely fell in love with it. I think I focused in on it a little bit as we go by it. It had some beautiful green isinglass in the stove itself. It was just really, really pretty. I also really love the kitchen in this place. I don't know if that's actually how the kitchens were set up back then, but I'm jealous because this house from the 1800s has about 5 times as much kitchen space as I actually have. Oh well. I have electricity, which is something that they didn't have back then. And you know, it's funny. I was stopped and I was thinking about it, and you think about all of the things that we take for granted and how we think we're doing so amazing. But it hit me the other day that back then they thought they were living in the future and they thought that life was at its peak. And, you know, it just makes you wonder what people are going to think about us in 100 years. All right, now, over half of the population of Fayette at its peak was actually kids. And like all kids, they had to go to school, they had to have playtime, they had to have a lot of chore time, but this was a representation of their schoolhouse. There's actually several one-room schoolhouses that are still intact in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, but this one, they added some of the toys that people had, a little bit of the living conditions, because Fayette is always used as a school group field trip time. So, of course, little young kids like to know what other kids did way back then for fun. And back then, wintertime, it was skating, it was sledding. In the summer, they could play croquet or they could go fishing. But it wasn't all fun and games. Back then, the ironing had to be done, the carpets had to be beaten, and laundry had to be done. And unlike now, laundry was a wash tub and buckets of water heated over the fire. Doesn't sound like too much fun, but you know, I think they grew up okay. Now, when I went into the schoolroom, I was immediately in love with this relief map of North America. I wouldn't mind having that on my wall, and if I couldn't have that, I wouldn't mind this little map of the United States puzzle. I thought it was pretty cool and a fun way to learn your states. Now, as you wander around, you definitely get your eye drawn to the largest house in town. It was affectionately known by the townspeople as the White House. The thing I love about it is the 2 giant lilac bushes that are in the front yard. I'm not sure if they're original from the 1800s, although it wouldn't surprise me, but they have been there every year that I've been coming, and I've been coming to Fayette since I was about a year old. So that's at least 50 years. Now, they have it decorated as the reception for the newlyweds. That was one of the superintendents of the house who was, what was his name again? Harry Mary, who was the supervisor back in the 1800s, one of many because most of the supervisors only lasted about 3 years. Rumor has it their wives couldn't take the place, but this place was all tricked out for Harry and his then wife Charlotte's wedding reception. Now, Harry, like a lot of men in his mid-20s, back in those days, his wife was a whole whopping 15 years old. Not something that I would approve of today, but I guess it was a lot more common back then. You have to definitely love the decoration that they put into here. It's actually really pretty. Now, the other thing that really amused me in the supervisor's house, and you'll see it here in a few minutes, is the rules of etiquette. I spent a long time reading the rules of etiquette and have pretty much decided that I would be kicked out on my ear in most polite company back then. It did make me laugh, but at the same time it kind of made me shake my head. I also really liked this library. I have a soft spot for libraries, but here it is the etiquette of the table, with how to set the table and all of the rules that you must observe. You must sit upright, neither too close nor too far from the table. Be sure to always eat your soup with your soup spoon, and don't play with your food. Never eat very fast. Never fill your mouth very full. Never attempt to talk when your mouth is full, and do not leave the table with food in your mouth. Never use anything but a fork or a spoon to feed yourself. It would probably hurt really bad if you used your knife. Don't ever pick your teeth or put your hand in your mouth while you are dining. Do not ever hesitate to take the last piece of cake or bread, because there's probably more. And as you can see, if you go to Fayette, you can spend as much time as me reading the rules of etiquette. Now, there were a lot of fires in Fayette, and as it says, although we enjoy the view from the windows, a lot of times it was probably a scary view, and it wasn't nearly as clean back then because, of course, this was not just a beautiful farming community. This place was a working community. It's nestled on Snail Shell Harbor, which is right in Lake Michigan. Beautiful limestone cliffs, gorgeous now clear waters, which you can scuba dive in with a permit, and I would recommend, if you're going to be scuba diving, wear 2 wetsuits because that water is cold. Now that right there is actually a red oak that they pulled out of the harbor from a boat that lost it. It's a really big tree, and it kind of shows you the size of trees that they were pulling out back then. Unfortunately, that is also one of the reasons that Fayette was eventually abandoned. Also on this day, of course, being me, I did manage to find the geese and the baby geese. I didn't try to feed them because I didn't have corn, but, you know, I had to zoom in and say hello. A little bit bigger than the geese out on my lake, although my babies are getting to be about that size now too. Have to always be distracted. As we turned and headed over to the furnace complex. Now, the furnaces at Fayette were huge. There were the 2 gigantic blast furnaces, and during its years of operation, the Fayette blast furnaces turned 229,288 tons of iron ore into what is known as pig or pig iron, which are about, from what I remember, about 100 pounds apiece, into, so they turn the raw iron pellets into pig iron and transported it to waiting facilities to be turned into all of those things that we use. We still use, and what was used back then, probably a lot of railroads, maybe a few cars. I can't remember when Henry Ford started making cars, but, you know, anything that you can use iron for. Now, the process for turning it into the pig iron is, what they would do is they would crush the iron ore and they would mix it with coal, charcoal, and limestone, and they would melt it into pigs and take it into the casting rooms and cast it into pig iron. If you keep an eye out here in a little bit, you're gonna see a stack of pig iron that they've actually excavated as they've been restoring Fayette. And I did find a really interesting thing about one of the iron workers, and that was Fred Hink. He was a famous iron worker. It was said that he could do the work of 2 men. He could lift 2 pigs at a time, and, you know, that would be about 200 pounds at a time. But unfortunately, he ended up crippling himself due to overwork. Not surprising. But on a good note, he didn't kill himself or die, because he ended up opening up a saloon just outside of Fayette. Now, he couldn't open up a saloon in Fayette because Fayette as a company town was a dry town. Now, right up there is a stack of pig iron. My son did try to pick one up and said, yep, it's definitely very heavy. Everything at Fayette was a very dangerous job. I think the only jobs that weren't really dangerous were, as always, the supervisor positions. There was a woman. Her name was Melanie Cabosel. She was a Belgian woman, and she came with her husband to Fayette. Her husband was just a regular Fayette worker, and he was making $1.80 a day when he died. And after he died, she had to work here at Fayette to support herself and her children. Unfortunately, she was only getting $1.50 every 2 weeks as a washerwoman for all of the local single guys, basically, at the hotel and stuff. So life was definitely hard. I mean, I guess life is always hard. Now, right now we are inside of the charcoal kiln, where they would take the hardwood, all of the oak trees and things like that, and turn it into charcoal to help make the pig iron. They used so many trees, and that actually is what ended up killing the town. They used up all the trees. You know, it takes a lot longer to grow a tree than it does to dig some iron out of the ground, I guess. Now up here is the lime kiln and the limestone quarry. So lime was pulled out and then heated to make, well, the limestone was quarried and then heated to make lime. And that made mortar, that made masonry, it made quicklime for lighting. It was a very useful product. I don't think it was all that safe to breathe, but back then we didn't exactly have OSHA, did we? In fact, there was no workman's comp, so you just had to really hope that you didn't get injured on the job. Now here's just another view of Snail Shell Harbor. It is gorgeous and always worth the time to just stop and look at it. Fayette does have about 5 miles of hiking trails. We didn't take the trails today for the video, but I have hiked them before and they are absolutely stunning. You hike up there amongst trees, which they have now found out are actually ancient. Some of the trees up on that cliff are 1400 years old. All right, now we're going to head up into the business district where we have the barber. Of course, you definitely have to have a barber in town. And I was reminded immediately of Little Shop of Horrors because I did remember that back then the barber was usually also the dentist. So I will definitely spare you the fact that while I was recording this, I was singing "You'll Be a Dentist." I can't help it. Every once in a while, I get a little bit goofy. But that is the barber shop, and we also have the grocery store, which we'll be heading into here in just a minute. But there is a picture of the barber shop in Fayette way back when. Kind of nice. I'm not sure that they would, give me a haircut, but they would definitely give a lot of guys a shave and a haircut. Now, this is the remains of the grocery store. It actually burned down on 2 separate occasions, and it was the company store. And speaking of songs that come into your head, every time I come up here and look at the company store and warehouse, I am reminded of the Tennessee Ernie Ford song from the 50s. My parents were big into country, so every time I come to Fayette, I think about that song. And even though it was about a coal mining town, it was pretty much true of Fayette too. I mean, most of the workers' money went back to the company. They were kind of almost held captive. It wasn't quite slave labor, but it wasn't quite not. Now, by 1891, the trees were gone, and the Jackson Iron Company, they pulled out. Most of the townspeople left, and the town began to be reclaimed by the woods, as happens to anything that is left abandoned for very long up here. It started to fall into ruin. But in 1958, the state of Michigan turned Fayette into a state park, and archaeologists began reconstruction, digging up things, finding all sorts of stuff. I mean, pretty much everything that you see on display was actually found here in Fayette. You can take a tour. You can just do a self-guided tour like I usually do. If you would like to come to Fayette, I would recommend coming in the summer because obviously, although it's open year-round, the town site itself is only open in the summer. But it's really easy to find. It is located in Michigan's Garden Peninsula along Road M183. Partway between Manitstique and Escanaba, and it's about 17 miles south of US 2. Michigan is a beautiful place. It is someplace I have always loved, and it's definitely worth a visit. And if you do come visit Fayette. I think you will probably really, really enjoy your time. Anyway, leave me a thumbs up if you don't mind. It does always make me smile, and hopefully I will be able to do a few more of these tourism videos showing off the area I live. But until then, have a wonderful, wonderful day.